You hear it before you see it. The sharp snap of parchment. The scrape of sandal leather against marble. The breath of a man who has conquered half the world. Now still, now waiting. In a war chamber lit by flickering oil lamps, Philip of Macedon unseals the scroll with steady fingers. His generals stand behind him, silent, expectant. They know what was written. They saw him dictate it. A threat brutal in its certainty. If I invade Laconia, I will destroy Sparta. He reads the reply aloud, voice echoing in the stone chamber. One word. If. That's all. No seal. No signature. No plea for peace. No invitation for war. Just a word as cold as iron and twice as sharp. A murmur stirs among the men. Is it a taunt? A dare? A bluff? But you feel something else. Something colder curling beneath your ribs. Because that word doesn't sound like defiance. It sounds like indifference. It doesn't come from arrogance. It comes from something older. Something darker. It comes from a people who have burned the fear out of their bones. You try to imagine them, these Spartans. What kind of nation sends no ambassadors? No explanation, no emotion. Only this, if. And now you hear it again behind the silence. The sound that isn't a sound. A heartbeat beneath the earth. A blade being drawn in a room you'll never see. A boy, 7 years old, taken from his mother's arms and thrown into a system that will tear his name away and build a weapon in its place. A slave who will not live to see tomorrow. A king who will die standing because kneeling was never an option. This word didn't come from courage. Came from conditioning. From ritual. From years of death disguised as discipline. It came from a city that raised its children on pain and called it patriotism. You thought Sparta was heroic, noble, honorable, but you have never looked beneath the helmet. You've never walked the training grounds soaked in boyhood blood. You've never smelled the rot of Helots hanging in the fields to make a warning out of a man. And now you're beginning to understand. That single word was not a shield. It was a warning, not to Philip, to you, to anyone who dares to remember Sparta through the lens of glory. Because the real Spartans were far more savage than history admits. You were taught to admire them, their spears, their shields, their sculpted silence. Hollywood carved them into icons, bare-chested gods, marching into death with noble fury. The camera never flinched. The blood was clean. The cause was pure. But the truth is not cinematic. It does not fit into frames. It is buried beneath the marble and the myth. Sparta was not a city of warriors. It was a machine, engineered for survival through subjugation, perfected through pain, polished with silence. You won't find the full story in textbooks. Too brutal for children, too inconvenient for glory, but archaeologists have uncovered it. Stone by stone, bone by bone. Under the training fields, beneath the dining halls, scattered across the mountains, fragments of the truth were waiting. Tiny rib bones belonging to infants not strong enough to live. Shattered skulls from ritualized duels between boys no older than 10. Charred remains of slaves bound and burned as warnings to their own kind. The records speak carefully when they speak at all. Xenophon, Plutarch, Herodotus, they admired Spartan law, but flinched from Spartan life. They described the systems, not the screams. They praised the order, but leave out the stench. The truth was not written. It was hidden, preserved only in what was left behind. The shallow graves outside the agoge. The claw marks inside cave walls used for helot executions. The iron shackles too small for grown men. You think discipline was their virtue. But it was never about discipline. It was about control. Control so complete that even the Spartans themselves could no longer recognize freedom. Control that turned grief into doctrine. That turned fear into structure. Boys were not raised. They were processed. Girls were not protected. They were inspected. Weakness was not corrected. It was culled. And all of it, every lash, every law, every lifeless child was buried under one word, glory. But now you've heard it. And if this is the first time you're hearing this, ask yourself, what else have they kept from you? Subscribe now. And if you won't, Tell us in the comments. Why wouldn't you want to know the truth? They took you when you were 7. You didn't cry. That was the first lesson. The second was how to hide pain. The third was how to inflict it. You are no longer a son. You belong to the state now. To Sparta. Your mother is not allowed to follow. Your name will not be called with affection. Your value will be measured in scars. This place they bring you to, the Agoge, is not a school. It is a crucible, designed not to teach but to strip away. The ground is dry, packed hard with the blood and sweat of boys who came before. Older ones circle the younger like wolves around wounded prey. They are not your brothers. They are your exam. You are starved deliberately, not to punish but to provoke. You are expected to steal. If you are caught, you are not punished for theft, but for failing to hide it well. Because Sparta doesn't want honesty. Sparta wants survivors. The instructors do not raise their voices. They raise their staffs. They beat without hatred because emotion would be weakness. They beat to shape. You are clay in the hands of men who were broken long ago. Some nights you hear sobbing, but no one admits it. No one stops it. The boy will be gone by morning, either reassigned or discarded. They teach you silence before they teach you words. They teach you death before they teach you life. And when the time comes, when they decide you're ready, they give you a knife. They do not tell you how to use it. They do not tell you who. Only that you must return with blood on your hands. Sometimes, it's another boy. He may be smaller. He may be someone who shared his bread with you. But that doesn't matter. What matters is loyalty. Not to a person. Not even to Sparta. But to the idea of Sparta, cold, absolute, and merciless. You kill not to survive. You kill to be seen. The elders watch. They nod. They say nothing. They do not praise. Because praise creates ego. And ego breeds fragility. What they want is obedience. And fearlessness. And the ability to sever your own humanity like a rotten limb. The Agoge does not raise warriors. It manufactures weapons. And history dares to call this discipline. The books use softer words, rigorous training, military excellence, preparation for civic duty, but they don't show you the bones. They don't show you the mothers who gave up their sons to the fire and called it tradition. They don't show you the 13-year-old with blood in his mouth and no voice left to scream. They say this built heroes. But tell me, if you raise a child in fear, if you train a boy to see mercy as weakness, if you teach him that love is a liability and grief is a disease, do you raise a hero, or do you raise a monster? This is Sparta's legacy. Not strength, not virtue, a generation of boys who never learned how to be anything else but unbreakable, until they broke. And now that you've seen what the Agoge truly was, you can't go back to the myth. So ask yourself, who benefits from calling this discipline? Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. Unless you'd rather keep imagining the leather and bronze, and not the blood behind it. And if that truth is too much, if you still think this was noble, explain it to the rest of us in the comments. We're listening. She stands at the gate, expression carved from the same stone as the walls behind her. Your mother, but not as you remember her. There are no tears, no trembling hands, no whispered blessings, only a nod. And a sentence so cold it burns, come back with your shield, or on it. That is not poetry. It is policy, a contract sealed in silence between a state and its mothers. You see, Spartan women were not weak. They were not hidden behind veils or locked behind doors. They walked openly, spoke freely, owned land. Their bodies were public property, and their wombs state infrastructure. From the moment a girl bled, she was measured for sturdiness. Her worth was not in virtue or beauty, but in her ability to breed warriors. The strong were groomed for coupling. The weak were discarded. The desirable were paired with proven soldiers to produce better stock. Eugenics, centuries before the word existed. She was raised to birth boys who would die, and she was taught never to grieve them. If the infant looked soft, too small, too slow to cry, she didn't get to name him. A council of elders inspected him like livestock. If he failed, he was taken, sometimes thrown into the chasm of Mount Taygetus, other times simply left exposed on cold rock, crying until the wild found him. And the mother? She didn't protest. She didn't beg. She turned her face to the sun and told herself it was necessary. She had to, because in Sparta grief was treason. She was not permitted to weep, not for the child discarded at birth, not for the son lost at war, not for the future she could never choose. Even praise was rationed. The highest honor was to have birthed 3 sons who died in battle. Only then could she wear a special garment to the festivals. Only then could she walk with her head a little higher. They will tell you Spartan women were empowered, that they were strong, and they were. But strength in Sparta was measured by how well you could serve the state, even when it asked for your children, even when it asked for your silence. What kind of power is that? To be free in voice but chained in purpose? To have rights but not choice? To carry life and never be allowed to protect it? They don't teach you this part. They call it patriotic motherhood. They celebrate it as noble. But when you look closer, you don't see strength. You see survival. You see women applauding their sons' deaths because no one ever taught them another way to live. You see a civilization that didn't just train warriors. It engineered a whole gender to manufacture them, mourn them, and then start again. Still thinking Sparta was a symbol of strength? Or are you finally seeing the nightmare beneath the armor? Subscribe unless you'd rather keep lying to yourself. And if so, say it proudly in the comments. We'll be watching. You thought the training ended when the boy became a soldier. Didn't. What came next was the final test. The quietest, the bloodiest, the most forgotten. They called it the Cryptia. There were no announcements, no ceremonies, no uniforms, just a whisper from an elder, and the dark. At 17, if you were chosen, you disappeared from the barracks and reappeared only after you had proven what kind of man you really were. You were sent into the wild, alone, unarmed except for a dagger, dressed in rags, fed like an animal. Your orders were not written. They were spoken softly, briefly, unblinkingly. Kill, not enemies, not foreign invaders. Helots, the slaves who plowed Sparta's fields, built its roads, served its tables. The people who outnumbered Spartans 10 to 1. You were told to find the strongest among them, the loudest, the most confident, and to eliminate them quietly, swiftly, permanently, not in war, not in battle, in sleep, in fields, in alleys, while they walked home unaware. There were no trials, no names recorded, no graves, because this wasn't justice. It was prevention. It was Sparta's way of thinning the herd, of keeping the Helots in fear, without ever letting them understand why the fear existed. You became the ghost in their fields, the shadow in their doorways, the reason their children didn't speak loudly, didn't stand tall, didn't run too fast. You were taught to move like mist, to kill without rage, because rage was emotion, and emotion was weakness. It wasn't personal. That was the lesson. The same way you weren't raised to feel love. You were not allowed to feel pity. One cut, clean. Don't look back. And when you returned, if you returned, no one asked what you had done. They didn't need to. You had become exactly what Sparta required. A blade with no conscience. This wasn't wartime. This wasn't punishment. It was state-sanctioned terror. You had been turned into a weapon and pointed at your own society. No foreign army ever posed a greater threat to Sparta than its own slaves. And so they built a secret force not to protect the people, but to protect the illusion of control. They called it tradition. They whispered of honor. But in the night it smelled like blood. The Cryptia didn't keep records. But its effects were carved into the way Helots walked, the way they lowered their eyes, the way they taught their children never to speak too proudly or move too fast. This wasn't discipline. It was horror in the name of order. And it wasn't some ancient one-time ritual. It happened every year. A legally declared massacre. A festival of fear dressed in silence. And we're supposed to admire this? Still think Sparta's greatness was built on honor? Or can you finally see it now? The warrior state that turned its own children into stalkers, its own youth into killers, its own knights into graves? Then subscribe to Cursed Chronicles because this is just the beginning. And if you're still romanticizing Sparta after this, go ahead. Defend it in the comments. We're waiting. They tilled the fields, built the walls, wove the cloth, raised the children, dug the graves. They were the blood in Sparta's veins. And yet they were not allowed to speak with pride, walk with dignity, or look a citizen in the eyes. They were the Helots. 7 out of every 10 people in Sparta lived and died as state property. Born into bondage, worked without rest, watched without mercy. But this wasn't slavery as you think you understand it. This was something far more elaborate, far more psychological, far more terrifying. The Helots didn't wear chains because they didn't need to. Their prison was invisible but absolute, held in place by rituals, by custom, by terror dressed in ceremony. Each year, as the harvest ended and the moon began its slow bleed across the sky, the Spartans declared war. Not on another state, not on invaders, on their own slaves. The declaration was symbolic, but its consequences were not. It meant that, for a short period each year, every Spartan citizen had the legal right to kill a Helot, without cause, without question, without punishment. They called it the right of balance. The rest of Greece called it something else, though never out loud. Murder. State-sanctioned slaughter. And it wasn't random. They didn't go after the old, the broken, the sick. They hunted the strong, the confident, the ones who walked with a straight back or spoke with too much intelligence. The ones who might one day dare to believe they were human. These purges were not just tolerated. They were celebrated. Young men returned from the hunt praised not for courage, but for cunning. A Helot who grew too tall was a target. One who sang too loudly. One who smiled too easily. Because in Sparta, pride was a crime for those not born to carry it. Imagine that. To be born beneath a people who trained their children to kill you in the night, then carved your silence into law, then buried your resistance beneath ritual. This was not punishment for rebellion. This was prevention of rebellion before the thought could even form. It was oppression, rehearsed and perfected, until it looked like peace. Until the outside world could look in and say, this is order, this is strength. But it wasn't. It was fear. And the bones beneath Sparta's roads will tell you that, if you listen closely. They never built statues for the Helots. They left no epics in their name. But they are there beneath every field, beneath every soldier, beneath every polished Spartan myth. This wasn't a system. It was a sickness. Still think Spartan society was noble? Still think its power was earned, not extracted? Then say it aloud. Say it where the Helots were not allowed to speak. Say it proudly or perhaps silently, as they were forced to. And if you finally see what this was, not discipline but ritualized oppression, then subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. Because history never cleaned this blood. It only hid it. And if you're still unsure, if you still believe there was glory in this, go ahead. Defend it in the comments. We'll wait in the dark. You've seen them on screen. Perfect bodies, gleaming bronze, faces locked in righteous fury, charging into death with poetic precision. The film rolls, the music swells, and the blood, clean, red, almost beautiful, paints the sand in symmetry. This is the version you were shown. 300. Gladiator. A dozen others. Stories sculpted for spectacle. Stories that strip Sparta of its filth, its fractures, its flesh and bone cruelty, and leave behind only legend. But the real Spartans? They didn't look like that. They didn't feel like that. They were not heroes. They were hardened boys grown into hollow men. Mutilated not in body, but in spirit long before the battlefield ever found them. They didn't march into war for glory. They marched because there was nothing else left in them but obedience. Because to hesitate was to be labeled weak. And in Sparta, weakness was a death sentence. They weren't sculpted by fitness. They were carved by starvation, by beatings, by frost and fire and nights spent in silence with wounds they weren't allowed to name. And Leonidas? Even he, king, warrior, martyr, was not immune. Before he stood at Thermopylae, before he became a symbol carved into pop culture. He was just another boy in the agoge, another child torn from his mother's arms, another face in the line, stripped of comfort, stripped of choice, forced to kill to prove his worth. He wasn't born fearless. He was burned into it. He lived under the same laws that told mothers not to cry, that told sons not to flinch, that told a whole society to confuse silence with strength. So when he stood at that narrow pass, with 300 at his side, it wasn't nobility that filled the air. It was inevitability. He knew what they were walking into, and he didn't stop. Because men like Leonidas were trained not to choose but to comply. Hollywood won't show you the cold. They won't show you the hunger, the broken toes, the bruises beneath the armor, the fear that was beaten so deep it became indistinguishable from loyalty. They give you speeches, slow motion, symmetry, but they don't give you what mattered most. The psychological horror of being shaped into something that could kill without blinking, obey without question, and die without resistance. They made you admire it. And you did. You clapped. You quoted. You shared it with your sons. But now that the curtain has lifted, now that the sand is soaked in something other than theater blood, what will you do? Will you keep pretending? Or will you admit that what they showed you was a lie? A polished lie with abs and lighting and slow-motion glory? If you see it now, if your hands feel colder and your breath slower, subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. Because this isn't entertainment. It's memory. And if you still think the movies got it right, if you still believe this was beauty and bravery, say so in the comments. We're done whispering. It didn't take a war to end Sparta. No great siege. No flaming ships. No final, glorious clash. Sparta fell from within. Not with a scream but a whisper. Not from weakness but from pride. Citizenship in Sparta was sacred. But not in the way you think. It wasn't about loyalty. It wasn't about merit. It was about blood. You were either born of Spartan parents, or you were nothing. No adoption. No elevation. No exceptions. This obsession with purity, this gatekeeping of identity, was the slowest, most silent death sentence Sparta ever wrote for itself. As wars dragged on and sons fell in battle, as disease and starvation and discipline chipped away at the youth, the city didn't open its arms, closed them tighter. They refused to adapt, refused to allow new citizens into the ranks, refused to let the Helots rise, even after generations of labor and loyalty. Instead, they turned inward. Marriages became calculations. Bloodlines shrank. Names grew fewer. And children were born weaker, sicker, more fragile with each passing decade. In time, to keep the numbers alive, cousins married cousins. Brothers' daughters were offered to uncles. The proud tree of Sparta's lineage twisted in on itself, roots choking roots. And by the time the rest of Greece looked up again, Sparta had hollowed out. By 371 BC, there were fewer than 1,000 full Spartan citizens left. A military empire of whispers, a kingdom of ghosts. They still stood tall, of course, still wore the red cloaks, still trained the few children they had in the ways of the old terror. But their power was gone. The army, once the most feared in the world, could barely man its own walls. The Helots, once crushed beneath iron law, began to see what the Spartans refused to admit. There were simply not enough of them left. And still they did not bend. They did not open the gates. They did not change. They shrank themselves into death, one generation at a time, not because they were conquered, but because they would rather die pure than live imperfect. And isn't that the final tragedy? That a civilization so obsessed with strength built its own extinction from the inside. That a city so proud of its control couldn't control its own decay. That a people so disciplined chose to disappear quietly rather than evolve loudly. Imagine a society so proud of its purity, it bled itself to extinction. Subscribe to Cursed Chronicles if you're not afraid to look history in the face. And if this makes you uncomfortable, if it's easier to turn away, go ahead. Confess it in the comments. We'll understand. They didn't die heroes. They died actors. By the time Rome swallowed Greece, Sparta was no longer feared. It was fascinating. Not for its army, not for its philosophy, but for its legend. The Romans came in robes and sandals, not with spears but with coin. And what they found wasn't a city. It was a stage. The Spartan phalanx no longer marched to war. It marched for applause. Tourists gathered in amphitheaters to watch young boys reenact the agoge. Ritual floggings staged for the crowd. Blood spilled, not for discipline but for entertainment. What had once been training to kill had become a spectacle for dinner guests. Foreign dignitaries came to walk the same dusty streets Leonidas once crossed. They bought trinkets, carved helmets, tiny red cloaks, paintings of warriors who never smiled. And behind the stalls, real Spartans stood, descendants of kings, now vendors, actors, guides. The rites continued, but hollow. The boys bled, but no longer for survival. They bled because the crowd expected it. Rome had turned Sparta into a museum. One still breathing, still moving, but no longer alive. Its stories sold better than its steel. Its myths drew more awe than its men. And so Sparta learned to perform itself. To bow, to reenact, to pretend. The very city that had once demanded silence was now repeating scripted lines for foreign ears. Not a warrior society, but a curiosity. Not a kingdom, but a memory in costume. Even the elders, the few who still remembered the fear, watched in silence as their past was carved into marble souvenirs. No one mourned it. No one stopped it. Because Sparta had done this to itself. The same obsession with control that had once built the greatest warriors had left them too rigid to change. And so the world changed around them, and then over them. They became the thing they once trained to destroy, a weak imitation, a symbol without substance, a ghost paraded by strangers who could never feel the weight of what the city once demanded. But the tourists didn't know that. They cheered, they pointed, they called it authentic. Because myth is more comfortable than memory, easier to digest, easier to admire. Sparta had become safe, and in becoming safe it had ceased to exist. If you've stayed this far, if you feel the discomfort rising in your throat, then you already know. This isn't about Sparta anymore. It's about how all great powers rot, not with fire, but with applause. So subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. Because the stories they give you are never the full story. And if you still prefer the polished version, the Hollywood Sparta, the red cloaks without the red blood, then say it in the comments. Say it proudly, because silence won't save you either. No trumpets sounded. No horns blew from the hills. No legions met in glorious resistance beneath a blood-red sky. When Sparta finally died, it didn't fall, it faded. The Visigoths came in 396 AD, not with prophecy, not with vengeance, just hunger and fire, and what they found wasn't a kingdom, it was a skeleton. No walls strong enough to hold, no warriors left to summon, no gods who still remembered their names. There were no last stands, no flaming gates, no echo of defiance shouted through the mountains. There was only a city too proud to grow, too rigid to bend, too hollow to rise again. The flames ate what time had spared. The stone cracked, the statues collapsed, and Sparta, once whispered in fear across the ancient world, was reduced to ash and dust, beneath boots that didn't even pause to wonder what this place had once been. It was not conquered. It was forgotten, not mourned, not missed. Its gods had long since stopped listening. Its ancestors had nothing left to protect. Even the soil no longer screamed. The silence wasn't tragic. It was fitting, because in the end, Sparta had built its empire on silence, on suppression, on strangled voices and broken sons and slaves who died without names. And silence was all that remained to carry it away. There were no epics written about the final fall. No poets dared make it beautiful, because there was no beauty left to find. Sparta, born in terror, raised on blood, died in shame, and yet, somehow, it survived. Not in reality, but in reputation. That is Sparta's greatest lie. that it lives on as legend, while its truth lies buried beneath centuries of misremembered honor. But now you've seen it. Not the myth, not the costume, not the fantasy forged for your comfort. You've seen what they were, what they did, what they became, and you can't look away. So subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. Or don't. But don't pretend you didn't hear this. Don't pretend you weren't told. The comment box is open. Tell us why you won't join us. We're listening, and history never forgets the ones who look, then turn away. The ashes settled. The wind moved on. And Sparta, once the iron heartbeat of Greece, was left behind like a discarded weapon, rusted and unrecognizable. But its story didn't vanish. It mutated. Whispers became epics. Atrocities became virtues. And blood-soaked rituals were dressed in honor and discipline. What the world remembered was not what happened. Because history does not preserve truth. Preserves belief. And what we believe about Sparta has little to do with who they were, and everything to do with who we wanted them to be. That's the curse. A civilization born in brutality, engineered through fear, obsessed with control, idolized by strangers who never touched its bones. The world forgot what Sparta did, but it never forgot the word Sparta. And so it echoes, in school books that call it noble, in films that paint it as heroic, in minds that confuse strength with silence, and cruelty with courage. But the truth does not die quietly. It waits, buried beneath the ruins, etched into the scars of the unnamed, frozen in the silence of the Helots, trapped in the ritual cries of children who never got to grow old. It was never glory. It was never peace. It was never justice. It was a machine, a system of suffering. And now you've walked through it, step by step, wound by wound. So what will you do with that? Forget it? Filter it? Rewrite it again? Or will you carry it forward? Ugly? Unflinching? Unvarnished? This was Cursed Chronicles, a place where myths bleed and silence speaks. Until next time, question everything, because some stories don't want to be remembered, but they remember you.